What if the people closest to Native Americans never left Asia? Imagine zooming in on a modern world map, looking for clues, any trace of where humanity once converged. Now pause. Because right there, in southern Siberia, nestled between cold mountains and forgotten rivers, is a people who shouldn't exist where they do. They are the Tuvans, and their DNA doesn't fit. Because in the swirling patterns of their genome lies something jaw-dropping, a genetic link to indigenous Americans that predates every border we know. We're not talking about migration influences or minor admixture. We're talking about a 69 to 72% genetic similarity, backed by multiple studies, beginning with Ilya Zakharov's 1998 mtDNA analysis, and later confirmed by Y-DNA and autosomal surveys. The shared signature, haplogroup QM242, an ancient paternal lineage born in the Altai Sayan Mountains between 17,000 and 31,000 years ago, the very ground beneath Tuva's soil. This same haplogroup dominates among Native American tribes, 92% in Navajo, 78% in Apache, and upwards of 90% in South American groups. It's the same genetic thread found in Anzic 1, the 12,500-year-old infant buried in Montana, one of the oldest DNA samples from the Americas. So here's the contradiction that stops historians cold. How can a group so genetically close to America's first peoples have never set foot outside of Asia? Maps tell us migrations flowed east, across the Bering Land Bridge, then vanished. But the Tuvans stayed. They didn't migrate. They remained in Tuva, practicing endogamy, preserving a frozen snapshot of humanity's earliest transcontinental voyage. And yet, on PCA plots and genetic maps, they're treated as outliers, too complex, too ancient, too anomalous to categorize. Because the real story of human migration isn't linear, and it sure as hell isn't flat. But how did these ancient ancestors become invisible on today's maps? How can a population be both completely isolated and wildly diverse? Now, hold that contradiction in your mind, because the answer lives at the very edge of the Siberian frontier, trapped in the lungs of the Sayan Mountains, and preserved in the very genetic soul of the Tuvan people. They didn't vanish from maps. They became a mirror no map could reflect, because their DNA is too ancient, too layered, too stubborn to be pinned down. Start here. Their gene pool is one of the most genetically heterogeneous in all of Siberia. We're talking about autosomal DNA that spans multiple ancient lineages, Yeniseian, East Siberian, Far Eastern, and yet this extraordinary diversity has survived inside one of the most endogamous populations in northern Eurasia. How? Because for centuries, documented since the Tsarist era and deep into Soviet ethnographic records, the Tuvans resisted external marriage, a fierce cultural resistance to assimilation even during waves of Russian colonization and forced integration policies. Entire clans, especially among the Tuvans Todzans, remained locked in secluded valleys, cut off by snow-covered ridges that would remain impassable for months. This wasn't just a geographical boundary, it was a genetic time capsule. Inside it, preserved undisturbed, are haplogroups and IBD blocks, tracing back not to one migration, but several. You see, their isolation is modern, a wall built in the last 300 to 500 years. But the diversity in their blood, that's ancient. We're talking 3,000 to 15,000-year-old genetic inputs, fused during massive waves of Bronze Age and Iron Age movements, across Central Asia, across the Altai-Sayan corridor, across the icy routes that led to the peoples of continents. The Tuvan genome, then, isn't a mix. It's a mosaic, a frozen mosaic, every shard a preserved memory of a long-forgotten journey. And somehow, despite the storms of history, that mosaic survived, unchanged, undisturbed, unblended. But what ancient migrations were frozen inside their blood? A single genetic marker links Siberia to South America. That sentence shouldn't be true. Not geographically, not historically, not according to any migration model you learned in school. But inside the DNA of the Tuvan people, there is a code that blows open the map of the ancient world. It's called haplogroup QM242. It was born somewhere between 17,000 and 31,700 years ago in the icy heart of the Altai-Sayan region, the very land the Tuvans still walk today. And it carries with it a secret, because this single Y chromosome lineage, passed from father to son, is also the dominant paternal marker in the indigenous peoples of the Americas. 92% of Navajo men, 78% of Apache, more than 90% in the Amazonian tribes of Brazil and Peru. And you know who else carries it? Tuvans, 62.5% in Tuva's Xinjiang branch, 52% in the Toju clans. It's not a fluke. It's not statistical noise. It's a biological bridge between hemispheres. In 1998, Russian geneticist Ilya Zakharov was the first to publish the unthinkable. Up to 72% genetic affinity between Tuvans and Native Americans. Later studies confirmed it across multiple lines. Y-DNA, autosomal S, NPS, and even mitochondrial traces. And then came the real shock. Anzic 1, a 12,500-year-old infant buried in Montana, unearthed with ceremonial red ochre and Clovis tools, carried a subclade of QM242. That same code still lives in the blood of reindeer herders and throat singers in southern Siberia. We're not just looking at a shared ancestor, we're staring at the living cousins of the first Americans. Tuvans are not echoes of history, they are its unbroken continuation. And the land they live on, Tuva, isn't just a remote dot on a Russian map. It was a launch pad, a genetic springboard across the ice, into the new world. If Tuva was a launch pad for human migration, what other secrets lie in their genome? Sometimes the most isolated are the most revealing, because while most of the world moved forward, built cities, crossed oceans, drew borders, the Tuvans stayed exactly where their ancestors first stood, and in that stillness they preserved something extraordinary. Climb with me now, north into the Sayan Mountains, through snow-thick forests and across wind-carved ridges. Here, in a silence older than memory, live the Urzek and Mongush clans. Names whispered in genealogies stretched across generations like living roots. Their DNA tells a story no scroll ever could. Start with the Y chromosome, passed from father to son like an invisible heirloom. In Tuvan men, we find haplogroup N102B1 making up nearly 24% of their lineages. It's a signature traced to the ancient Uralic and Yeniseian-speaking peoples, and it holds the marks of what scientists call a founder effect. That means, at some moment in deep time, a small group of men settled, expanded and left behind a sharply defined genetic imprint, not watered down, not blended out. And then comes Q1B1A, present in 13% of Tuvans. This subclade connects them again to Scythian-era steppe nomads, and directly to the QM242 macrohaplogroup we saw in the last segment, linking them to the Americas. Even rarer, but just as meaningful, are C2 tied to early Central Asians, and R1A, the ancient marker of Indo-European migrations, likely introduced during Scythian or Saka expansions in the first millennium BC. Altogether, it's not just diversity, it's an archive. Each haplogroup a thread, each thread an untold story. But what preserves them is perhaps more powerful than what they contain. Geographic isolation, valleys too steep for outsiders, winters too brutal for colonizers, and a culture that chose memory over mixing. No empires diluted them, no highways erased them. In their bones, across generations, Tuvans carried the legacy of entire vanished civilizations. But were they always alone in these mountains? Buried beneath the kurgans are stories no textbook ever told you. Because the mountains didn't just keep the Tuvans isolated, they kept their ancestors entombed in gold, bone and myth, and what was buried was never forgotten. High on the Uyuk plateau of Tuva, archaeologists uncovered tombs older than Rome. In 1971, the frozen ground of Arzan I, known as the Valley of the Kings, gave up its secrets, royal kurgans, thousands of artifacts, and the DNA of the steppe's silent rulers. This wasn't just a local burial, it was the grave of a Scythian prince, dated to around 800 BCE. Inside, Y-DNA haplogroup Q1b1, the same line found in modern Tuvans, and shared by Paleo-Siberian tribes, even Native Americans. Right beside him, a noblewoman. Her mitochondrial DNA was haplogroup G, linking her to ancient Okinawa populations from the Bronze Age. Suddenly the timeline snapped into place. Okinawa, approximately 2000 BCE. Aldibel Scythians, approximately 800 BCE. Uyuk Sagli nomads, approximately 200 BCE. Modern Tuvans. No breaks, no erasure, just buried continuity. These weren't wandering tribes, they were monarchs of mobility, spiritual rulers of a horse-born empire, and they brought more than weapons. Burial mounds like Ching Te Kwan, uncovered in 2008, show ritual precision, clay idols, carved deer stones, and red ochre burial chambers mimicking the womb. A return to origins, a rebirth into the spirit realm. And it wasn't just cultural, it was genetic. The same Y chromosome lineages still alive in the blood of Tuvan clans today. Even the Scythian tattoos found preserved in permafrost at Pazyryk sites across the Altai mirror the sacred symbols of current Tuvan shaman drums. This isn't just heritage, it's the embodiment. The Tuvan people are walking, breathing archives of the steppe. And yet, when you look at today's maps, all you see is a small republic on Russia's fringe. No trace of a civilization that ruled with spirit and steel for over 2,500 years. But if their history is so ancient, why do modern maps ignore it? How can an empire conquer your culture, but not your blood? Because sometimes conquest leaves no trace in the genome. Look at Tuva in the 13th century. Genghis Khan's empire thunders across the steppe, an unstoppable wave of war horses, banners and fire. And when the dust settles, Tuva bows. Not just militarily, but culturally. Mongol rule shapes their language, their customs, even their sacred rituals. Centuries of political control. Tuvan clans like the Urzak and Mongush, names with Mongolic echoes, rise under the shadow of the Mongol elite. But when scientists studied their DNA, the truth shattered expectations. The C2 and O2 haplogroups, dominant in over 75% of Mongols, barely show up in Tuvans. In fact, only 17% of their paternal lineages carry Mongolic markers. Even in the most Mongol-influenced clans, the very families expected to show the heaviest impact, the numbers are shockingly low. The conclusion: no mass migration, no genetic flood, just cultural dominance from the top down. This is what scientists call the elite dominance model, when a small ruling class imposes its language, religion and governance, but doesn't replace the local people. It's not evolution, it's identity by pressure. So yes, the Tuvans speak a Turkic language. Yes, they celebrate rituals that echo Mongol cosmology. And yes, they were ruled by Khalkha-Mongol lords deep into the 17th century. But under the skin, in their bones, they are still southern Siberians, still Altaic, still autochthonous. And that creates a powerful contradiction. A people who look Mongol in speech and custom, but carry the unbroken bloodlines of an older world. Because in the story of human identity, language is loud, but DNA whispers the truth. So if not the Mongols, who shaped their real genetic story? This isn't just a region, it's the genetic motherboard of Eurasia. Because if you follow the bloodlines that built the ancient world, they don't lead to empires. They lead here, where a Tuva touches the sky. The Altai-Sayan Mountains, rising between southern Siberia, Mongolia and the edge of Kazakhstan, are not just geography. They're where the deepest migrations of Eurasia crashed into each other and left behind their DNA. Start with the Okunivo culture, Bronze Age Siberians from around 2000 BCE. Archaeogenetic studies from the Minusинsk Basin reveal their unique mix of West Eurasian and East Siberian ancestry, a blend that would become a cornerstone in the Tuvan genome. Fast forward to the Scythian Iron Age, roughly 800 to 200 BCE, and that same ground becomes a stronghold for Aldibel and Uyuksagli nomads. And what do we find in their burial mounds? Y DNA. Q1B1R1A and mtDNAG, markers that are still carried by modern Tuvans. Then come the Southern Altaians, Khakas and Shors, Turkic-speaking groups with strong genetic overlap. A 2023 IBD study showed the Tuvans share maximum autosomal blocks with these groups, especially along ancient pastoral migration routes. And at the very root of this web is haplogroup N1A2B1, one of the oldest branches of the North Eurasian tree, and Q-M242, born somewhere in this exact region between 17,000 and 31,000 years ago. Both emerged here, not spread into Tuva, born in it. This wasn't a place people passed through, it was a place people emerged from. And what makes it haunting? These lineages, N, 1A2B, 1 and Q, would later define the Paleo-Siberians, the Samoyeds, even the first Americans. They are the parent codes of continents. Yet their origin story, Tuva, remains in the margins of genetic maps. Why? Because our tools, PCA plots, linear migration models, nation-state labels, flatten out complexity. They erase the very places where human identity was forged. But why don't our tools for mapping DNA show us this story? What if the map in your textbook erased 20,000 years of memory? Because most of what we think we know about genetics is drawn in two dimensions. Black lines on white paper, clusters in a scatter plot, dots boxed into nations. But try to map the Tuvan genome, and the tools begin to crack. Take the PCA plot, one of the most common visualizations in genetic science. It simplifies genetic relationships by collapsing thousands of data points into just two axes. A brilliant tool, but one with blind spots. When scientists plot Tuvans on a PCA graph, they show a wedge between East Asians and Central Asians. Neat, clean, predictable. But it's a lie, because the Tuvan genome isn't flat. It's layered, like sediment, like ice cores, like memory. Behind that average PCA dot are QM242, N1A2B1, R1A-C2, traces of Denisovan introgression and maternal threads from Bronze Age Okunevo and Iron Age Scythians. A complex web built over 20,000 years, flattened into a single pixel. Trying to understand the Tuvans through modern tools is like trying to describe a glacier from its shadow. And that distortion doesn't just affect science, it affects identity. Because when the graph says East Asian, maps follow. When the model says Central Asian, textbooks comply. Borders get drawn, ancestries get rewritten, and peoples like the Tuvans get lost between categories. But they're not invisible. They've been singing their lineage all along, in rituals passed down in nomadic herding songs, in throat-sung epics that encode their cosmology, in oral histories that remember floods and migrations the genome confirms. Their story doesn't break science, it reveals where science needs to grow. Because you can't reduce ancient people to a dot when their ancestry paints the whole canvas. So what kind of map do the Tuvans actually belong on? You've heard of the Bering Land Bridge, but you've never seen its guardians. Because if maps fail to show us where Tuva fits, DNA might reveal what we forgot. That the Tuvans are the biological storytellers of one of the greatest journeys in human history. When we talk about the peoples of the Americas, we imagine Siberian hunters crossing the Bering Land Bridge sometime around 16,000 years ago, maybe earlier. But that's where the story ends in most textbooks. No names, no faces, no voice from the place they left behind. But the QM242 haplogroup, a genetic signature born in the Altai-Cyan region, tells a different story. It shows up in Native American tribes from the Apache and Navajo all the way down to the Quechua in Peru and the Mapuche in Chile, and it's strongest in Tuva. According to a Zakharov et al. Study, 2010, modern Tuvans show up to 72% genetic affinity with indigenous American groups, not cousins, not distant relatives, but the genetic siblings of a journey carried through time. In side-by-side genome sequencing, the resemblance between Tuvan QM242 profiles and ANZIC1, the 12,600-year-old infant discovered in Montana, is so tight scientists had to double-check for contamination. And that's not where the echoes stop. Tuvan throat singing, known as kumi, isn't just sound, it's vibration, a communion with land, sky, spirit. Much like the ceremonial chants of the Navajo Diné, or the Andean panpipe prayers offered to Pachamama. Even their animistic cosmologies mirror each other. Mountain spirits, sacred animals, shamanic intermediaries, two ends of the earth, singing the same spiritual song. It's not mimicry, it's a memory, cultural fossils passed down through sound. So what if Tuva isn't just a region of Siberia? What if it's the voice still echoing from the starting line of the Americas? If the Tuvans remember the crossing, what else have we forgotten? They call it Russian territory, but their DNA belongs to another world. And that's the truth no one maps. Because when you trace the bloodline of the Tuvans, it doesn't follow modern borders. It carves its own path, through language, through time, through history that refuses to stay inside lines. Officially, Tuva is a republic within the Russian Federation, but the genome doesn't care, because the same ancient signals QM242, N1A2B1, R1A-C2 are found scattered across Mongolia, Xinjiang in China, and parts of eastern Kazakhstan. This isn't an isolated patch, it's a corridor, an ancient bloodstream that flowed long before anyone drew flags on maps. Zoom out on a time-lapse, centuries flickering by. Empires rise, fall, redraw lines. The Qing dynasty, the Mongol Empire, the Soviet Union. Each one stamps its name on Tuva, but none of them can rewrite the genome, because inside their blood, the Tuvans hold something no ruler could annex, a transnational identity coded in prehistory, a living fossil of movement, resilience and connection. Even the way they speak, Tuvan, a Turkic language with Mongolic and Yeniseian substrate layers, shows the same refusal to stay inside one camp. Their rituals echo Altai. Their ancestry reaches to Alaska. Their songs vibrate with Sayan mountains and Andean memories. Yet every textbook, every database, pins them in one place. Russian. As if that explains anything, it doesn't explain why a Tuvan shepherd in the Tanuola Mountains shares a Y DNA marker with a Yakut in Siberia and an Apache in Arizona. It doesn't explain how ancient migrations wove a body of people across half a continent, then locked them behind paperwork. So ask yourself, if a genome travels thousands of miles, but a passport locks it in one place, who's telling the real story? But if Tuva transcends borders, what future does this ancient genome have in the modern world? Their story isn't in your textbook. It's buried in your ancestry, because what you're calling a remote region is actually a living chronicle. The Tuvans are not anomalies on a map. They are time capsules shaped by unbroken waves of history. Imagine the bones of thousands of ancestors whispering through your veins. Shared DNA markers, QM242N102B1, R1AC2, they're not curiosities. They are thousands of years of cultural resistance, built up and preserved, since the Okinawa era, approximately 2000 BCE. Flowing through the court of Scythian kings, 800 BCE, surviving Mongol eclipses, 12th century CE, enduring Soviet redraws, 1921 to 1990s, all the way to modern republic status in 1992. The genome doesn't just defy borders, it rewrites them. Because every time a historian drew a line, the Tuvans were already woven into an ancestral tapestry that spans continents. They never fit the boxes, they transcend them. And what does that mean for us today? This wasn't survival by chance, it was preserved by purpose. Through harsh winters and shifting empires. They sustained shamanic music, oral epics, throat singing, and clan genealogy etched in stone and song. They carried ancient viral signatures tied to Pleistocene migrations, ancestry informative markers that link them to Siberian Ice Age refugia, and signals of Denisovan admixture hidden deep in non-coding DNA. For other people, their heritage is a dot. For Tuvans, it is an unbroken story. So yes, this isn't just a people case study. It's a cry across time. That identity in and is deeper than borders, stronger than language, more enduring than empires, and their genome isn't a dot on today's map. It is the map. If you're fascinated by lost histories and ancient DNA mysteries, subscribe for more untold stories. Next time, we travel further back to the Ice Age ancestors that still live in us.